So as you all know, Donald Trump and the Republicans are currently in talks with Democrats to either revive DACA or pass the DREAM Act. Now, everyone in DC is scrambling because there is a midnight deadline approaching on Friday, and if they don't agree to something by then, the government shuts down. Now, there's a couple of different ways this could all play out. They could potentially agree to a temporary fix and basically postpone negotiations until March. They could also agree to the Republican Party's plan to pass the DREAM Act, as well as funding for Donald Trump's border wall, or they could agree to the Democrats' plan, which is a clean version of DACA or a clean version of the DREAM Act. Either way, time is running out, and if they don't act quickly, then the government's going to shut down, and somebody is going to get blamed for that. Now, Bernie Sanders is making sure that if anyone gets blamed, it's going to be Donald Trump and the Republicans. And he penned an op-ed in the Washington Post saying just this, that if the government does in fact shut down, it's going to be Republicans and Donald Trump that are going to have to take the blame. And he has good reason to do this. I think this is an excellent strategy for him to be pursuing, as well as the Democrats to pursue. One, because as usual, the Republican Party's demands are completely unreasonable. And second of all, well, there's this.
Build that wall. Now, the obstructionist Democrats would like us not to do it, but believe me, if we have to close down our government, we're building that wall.
If we have to close down our government, we're building that wall.
Gotcha, bitch!
So, if the government shuts down, we all know who the culprit is. You just saw it. Donald Trump, who months ago said he'll make sure he gets that border wall even if the government has to shut down. So Bernie Sanders went on the Senate floor and called on Donald Trump and the Republicans to support the passage of a clean version of the DREAM Act with no stipulations or any other policies attached to it like the border wall. And as he usually does, he holds Congress accountable and tells them to do what the overwhelming majority of the American people want. So I'm going to show you the phenomenal speech that Bernie Sanders made on the Senate floor, a clip from it. It's longer, so I'll link to that below. But I'm going to show you what Bernie Sanders said, and then, in spite of what I think is a great strategy, I'm going to tell you what one journalist said about Bernie Sanders' strategy and why this journalist thinks Bernie Sanders is being unreasonable here.
I rise today to speak on behalf of nearly 800,000 dreamers, young people who were brought to this country as children, who today are living in fear and uncertainty. As a result of the Trump administration's decision to end the DACA program, these young people are at risk of losing their legal status and, in fact, face deportation from the only home that most of them have ever known. And that home is the United States of America. This is one of the great moral issues of our time, and it is an issue that must be dealt with now as part of the budget negotiations. It cannot be kicked down the road any longer. We must pass the DREAM Act now as part of the current budget negotiations. Each day the Congress does not act, 122 people lose their DACA protections, 851 people each and every week. This is a matter of urgency, and we have got to act accordingly. But I want to assure my Republican colleagues that not only is this the right thing to do from a moral perspective, from an economic perspective, it is also exactly what the American people want. Nobody here is asking anybody in the United States Senate to rise up and to be extraordinarily brave and courageous. Why don't you just do what the American people want us to do? No profiles in courage are needed now. Poll after poll have shown that the overwhelming majority of the American people want to provide legal status to the dreamers and to protect them from deportation. From a political perspective, this is not a difficult decision. I am, however, very concerned that President Trump is using the 800,000 Dreamers as a bargaining chip to force the taxpayers of this country to pay for an $18 billion wall. An $18 billion wall. Now, some may remember that during his campaign for president, Donald Trump told the American people that it was the Mexican government that would be paying for the wall. Well, it turns out that it didn't quite work out that way. And now it is the taxpayers of this country who are supposed to pay for a wall. Mr. President, let me be as clear as I can be. We cannot and we must not hold the lives of 800,000 young dreamers hostage in order to fund a wall that the vast majority of the American people oppose.
Now, he then brought out a poster, including a quote from Donald Trump, where Donald Trump basically states that he is willing to shut down the government in order to get that border wall. And Bernie Sanders did this so he can hold Donald Trump directly accountable in the event of a government shutdown. I mean, this is how you play politics. You use someone's words against them so that way if something happens, they take the blame for it. And Donald Trump, since he has a big mouth, he already preemptively took the blame for shutting down the government. It's because he wants this border wall. So I'm proud of Bernie Sanders for staying strong here. We need people who will advocate for dreamers and be relentless and not back down. However, one journalist, as I mentioned earlier, is angry because Bernie Sanders is not buckling. I'm not kidding about that. He is literally angry that Bernie Sanders is not compromising with Republicans here. Even though Donald Trump, just last week, seemed open to the idea of passing a clean DACA bill, even though Bernie Sanders basically backed Republicans into a corner. CNBC journalist Jake Novak argues that Bernie Sanders is wasting his political capital and hurting Democratic Party aims and his own legacy, essentially because he's refusing to compromise and not rolling over and dying like Democrats usually do. So he argues, Senator Bernie Sanders has never been the silent type. He's making noise again with a series of TV appearances and an op-ed this week preemptively blaming Republicans for a potential government shutdown. More than a year after his stunningly impressive Democratic presidential primary run, this is just the latest example of Sanders engaging in fiery rhetoric. But that's the problem. Democrats need Sanders to do more than rant, and he needs to do more than that as well if he wants a legitimate political future. With the passage of the tax reform bill, Republicans have proved they are a real threat, and Democrats can see verbal attacks alone aren't going to stop the Trump/GOP legislative agenda. But unlike the tax bill, the current budget and immigration issues will require at least some Democratic votes to resolve, handing them a golden opportunity. If there ever was a time for Bernie to get involved and push for some real compromise, this is it. But so far, he's still all talk. Sanders was a no-show at that big publicly televised meeting at the White House Tuesday on the budget and immigration issues. So, after the Republican Party has backed themselves into a corner, after Donald Trump admitted that he's willing to shut down the government to make sure that his border wall is funded, this journalist thinks that now is a good time to compromise, to buckle, to roll over and die to the demands of the Republican Party. If we agreed to this as a political strategy, nothing would get done. It'd just be the Republicans getting every single thing that they want. So because Bernie Sanders refuses to agree to Donald Trump's unreasonable demands, and because he's holding strong, Bernie Sanders is the bad guy in this situation. I mean, if you have the winning argument, if you're on the right side of history, you have no reason to compromise. Stand up and fight for what you believe in. And this is what I absolutely loathe about liberals and the Democratic Party. The minute Republicans indicate that they're going to play hardball, they just roll over and die. Oh, please don't push for this or that. We'll give you whatever you want. I mean, this happened with the Obamacare negotiations. Democrats were so terrified of Republicans that they didn't even propose single payer as an option. Instead, they started by moving the goalpost and compromising an already right-wing healthcare policy, And they initially introduced a public option, but they couldn't even hold strong on that. So we got a watered-down right-wing healthcare plan. I mean, this is what happens. Democrats have got to take a stand. If you believe in something, then fucking fight for it. What are you doing compromising? How could you possibly think that compromising and giving in to Donald Trump's extreme demand, to the demands of a proto-fascist right-wing extremist party, is going to do anything to help out citizens? Dreamers don't need someone who just tepidly supports them and is going to be a mealy-mouthed liberal. We need people who's going to get out there and be a fire breather and advocate for them because their lives are at stake here. Imagine, just put yourself in their shoes. You don't know what your life is going to be like 6 months down the line. You could get deported. You have a job right now. You could end up in a country that you're completely unfamiliar with, that you didn't grow up in, and be homeless. Your situation could change completely. Imagine having to look over your shoulders everywhere you go because there's a bunch of people that are questioning your status and whether or not you should or shouldn't be here. Imagine living like that. I couldn't. That would be a terrible life to live. So I'm sorry. There's no room for compromise. Pass a clean version of DACA or get blamed for it. But this author is encouraging Democrats and Bernie Sanders to employ the exact opposite strategy that they should be using. Democrats have always had the tendency to roll over and die, and Bernie Sanders isn't doing that. So the author is insisting here that Bernie Sanders isn't a serious politician. He's not a serious actor because he's unwilling to compromise. And also, Sanders doesn't seem the least bit interested in getting into actual governing. In fact, he still isn't even officially a member of the Democratic Party. Sanders did craft a bill calling for the federal government to negotiate prescription drug prices for the entire country like it currently does for Medicare, but the bill went nowhere, and there's no evidence that Sanders made any effort to negotiate the plan with the White House. He has another bill to provide single-payer style health coverage for all Americans that has more than a dozen Democrat co-signers, but that bill isn't going anywhere. Proposing bills that have no chance of passing in a majority Republican Congress isn't the best way Bernie can use whatever political capital he earned from the election. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. Sanders has been in Congress since 1991, but has barely had a legislative impact in Washington during that 27-year period. Other than going through the grueling effort of running for president, it's a fair argument to say that Bernie remains a lot more bark than bite. Real political leaders have to make compromises. That stinks sometimes, but otherwise nothing gets done. What will Bernie choose? Sorry, Bernie, but since you're not willing to compromise with the unreasonable demands of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, even if you have them backed into a corner where they can get blamed for a government shutdown, you're not the real grown-up. According to this journalist, Bernie Sanders doesn't know how governing works, but I mean, what could Bernie Sanders possibly know about governing? They only call him the Amendment King, but I mean, he knows nothing apparently. He's done nothing in his 27 years in Congress, according to this biased journalist. The thing about negotiations is that you need to look at the bigger picture and what Republicans are demanding. Democrats have the argument that the American people agree with. So you don't have to negotiate with the right-wing extremist party's unreasonable demands if you have the American people on your side and if the party was already willing to take blame for a government shutdown. And guess what? Even CNN, a news organization that boasts about how neutral they are, published an article explaining how Democrats are, quote, letting Republicans fundamentally reframe the immigration debate. So when someone from CNN implies that Democrats are too weak, then certainly they're too weak. But this journalist is saying, well, they need to be even weaker. They need to compromise. They need to buckle and not hold strong and be even weaker. Now, he also implied here that Bernie Sanders' bills like Medicare for All was a bad idea because, I mean, these bills have no chance of passing in a right-wing controlled Congress. But the reason why Bernie Sanders introduced this and why we cheerleaded him on when he introduced this was because introducing it now gives you the chance to put in the work to cultivate a massive coalition so that way when Democrats do take back Congress, if we can get enough progressives in there, a lot of the work for this bill will have already been done. So after reading this article, I get the impression that this journalist doesn't really know how governing works. He doesn't know the importance of putting in time to build coalitions and making sure that you hold strong. I mean, what message does that send to Bernie Sanders supporters or even Democratic Party voters if their party buckles at Every chance they get, they're never ever willing to hold strong. I mean, I remember back in 2010, before they ultimately decided to vote to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there were so many times when they signaled that they were not going to hold strong and buckle. We need people to fight for us. If we elect them, they represent us. So why are you discouraging them from doing that? Why are you telling them to give in to the demands of a party that is unreasonable? I mean, it makes no sense to me. So I really hope that Bernie Sanders disregards this argument and does what he is continuing to do. Because to say that Bernie should compromise or that Democrats should be even weaker, it's absurd to me. I can't even comprehend how someone could come to that conclusion. This segment of the Humanist Report was brought to you by 7coffeeroasters.com. They're a minority-owned small business in Seattle, and they specialize in roasting unique and delicious coffee that's not actually roasted until you've placed your order. And the best part is that they actually ship out all orders within 24 hours, so you get your coffee and it still tastes fresh when it arrives. And to boot, they're also a progressive company that pays their workers a living wage and actually cares about the country. So to support them and experience the deliciousness of their coffee, you can check out 7coffeeroasters.com.